Good morning, and thank you all for coming to this session. My name is Michael Weeks, and I'm an environmental historian in the history department. And I'll be introducing this session to you. Before we do, I would like to also tell you that if you come to the noon session, there will be pizza, and it will be free. Our first speaker today is going to be George Handley, who is a professor of interdisciplinary humanities at Brigham Young University. After teaching for 3 years at Northern Arizona University, go Lumberjacks, did my master's there. George Handley came to BYU in 1998. He has training in comparative literature, focusing on the literatures of the Americas. He has also co-edited Caribbean Literature and the Environment, Stewardship and the Creation, LDS Perspectives on the Environment, and Post-Colonial Ecologies. His book, Home Waters, A Year of Recompenses on the Provo River through the University of Utah Press, is a work of creative nonfiction that includes nature writing, personal and environmental history, and reflections on eco-theology. He is currently working on a book right now called From Chaos to Cosmos, Literature and Eco-Theology. And I should also point out that he crosses a lot of boundaries because he's now serving on the Provo City Council. So he has politics as well as science and ethics all involved in his thinking. So let's welcome George Handley.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to be here. I will just speak for a few minutes, and then I understand we're going to move on to the others and then have hopefully time for discussion. I just thought I was asked to sort of present some thoughts about stewardship of the air as understood by Latter-day Saint theology. This is an area that I've been involved in for some time, and actually one thing that Michael didn't mention is that I do have a collection of essays on Latter-day Saint theology and environmental stewardship that will be published sometime next year. So I've been working on this question for about 20 years, even though it wasn't my area of specialization in my training. But when I moved to Utah, I felt the need to engage on environmental issues as a Latter-day Saint. Maybe two sort of interesting moments that might be relevant for our discussion today, and one is back in 1989, there was a Clean Air Symposium at BYU, and Hugh Nibley spoke at that symposium. And Hugh Nibley, if you don't recognize his name, was a very prominent Latter-day Saint scholar and theologian, and who saw the environment as something that was endangered here in Utah Valley because of Geneva steel in particular. And so he gave a speech at that symposium on stewardship of the air. It was sort of an interesting concept, but he drew from the teachings of Brigham Young, one of the founding leaders of the Latter-day Saint tradition, as well as a more recent leader of our church, Spencer Kimball. And I'll read two statements that he quoted from in his address. "You are commencing here anew," this is Brigham Young, "the soil, the air, the water are all pure and healthy. Do not suffer them to become polluted with wickedness. Strive to preserve the elements from being contaminated by the filthy, wicked conduct and sayings of those who pervert the intelligence God has bestowed upon the human family." Brigham Young also said, "The world is after riches. Riches is the God they worship. What constitutes health, wealth, joy, and peace? In the first place, good, pure air is the greatest sustainer of animal life." And then he quotes from President Kimball, who said, "The brethren constantly cry out against that which is intolerable in the sight of the Lord, against pollution of mind, body, and our surroundings." So there's an interesting connection between the idea of moral pollution and physical pollution that Hugh Nibley then developed quite at length in his own argument. Now, he wrote another couple of essays late in his life about environmental stewardship. They were published, they were read, but they didn't really change the culture as much as I'm sure he would have liked. the good news is there has been quite a flourishing of what is known as eco-theology within the Latter-day Saint tradition over the last 20 years, at least in the scholarly realm. And I think there's progress, as slow as it may be, in a shift in the culture. I was paying quite close attention, have been ever since John Curtis was elected, to see what he's going to do as a member of Congress, as a former mayor of my city, and one of the people who encouraged me to run for city council in Provo, so I kind of blame him for having stepped into the fray. But I'm always interested to know what kinds of pressures are acting on him and how he's responding. And recently he spoke on the Natural Resources Committee about climate change, and I was all ears to see what he was going to say. And he is not, fortunately, taking a position of denial on climate change, but he's emphasizing the personal stewardship that I think we all have in taking care of clean air as a point of common ground between climate change and maybe among people who are more skeptical about climate change, but who at least can get on board with the idea of stewardship of air quality. It's interesting that he sort of points to the sort of Boy Scout leave no trace notion and basic stewardship as one of his founding principles. And I would just point out from maybe a doctrinal point of view that Latter-day Saint theology, just to be very brief here, believes in and has a number of values and teachings that I think are very relevant to the question of air quality. One, of course, is that Latter-day Saints care very much about families and about children in particular and about future generations. The idea that's drawn from the verses in Malachi of the hearts of the fathers being turned toward the children is an ethic of stewardship toward the future. And that's certainly what motivated me when I ran for city council, and the idea that in 2100, when most of the really bad projections about climate change that are certainly relevant to air quality are given, presumably if my children will have children eventually, I could have grandchildren who are in their 70s or 80s. And that's, so that now feels much closer to me and more important. Freedom and self-reliance are very important principles in Latter-day Saint theology, but they're often misunderstood, I think. They're not calls to be atomistic and individualistic. They are calls to be caring for others and to be stewards of the earth is also a reason to then be in a better position to help the poor. And so there is a very communitarian, strong ethic that I think needs to be emphasized and rescued from more individualistic and atomistic ethics that are sometimes much more in control of our cultural discourse. And finally, Latter-day Saint theology really stresses the spiritual creation that happens before the physical creation. Plants and animals are living souls in Latter-day Saint theology. The world is alive, it is sentient, it is full of subjects that are non-human as well as human, and they require our regard as the world is holy, and it is sanctified by the act of creation itself, and therefore requires our careful stewardship. There is, in other words, no room within Latter-day Saint theology, as I understand it, for a kind of human beings first ethics that says what we do should be done for us and for the short term, regardless of how it impacts the environment or non-human life. That is clearly stated in many different scriptures. I'm happy to share some of those with you, but I would just simply state that there is that sense that the sanctity of the body that is very important in Latter-day Saint theology is also the sanctity of the earth. It is the sanctity that is guaranteed by the spiritual creation, and therefore requires us to be circumspect in our uses of nature, as it is said in one Latter-day Saint scripture, with judgment not to excess and neither by extortion. So there is a moderation and modesty and humility that we should be using as a guiding value in the way that we use nature. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
If you don't mind, I think we'll hold off on questions until the end. So if you would write down or hold in your mind the thoughts that you have right now, and we finish all three speakers, we'll get to those. Our next speaker is Carl Moore, and he is the chairman of the Peaceful Advocates for Native Dialogue and Organizing Support, or PANDOS for short. He is also, as well as a chairperson for the Salt Lake City Air Protectors, both Native-led nonprofits engaged in human rights and environmental rights. Carl's father is Hopi, and his mother is English, Irish, German, Mexican, and Chimiweve. He is a member of the Colorado River Indian Tribes in Arizona, and he majored in political science and minored in American Studies at Utah Valley University. If you would welcome Carl.
All right. Come here. Okay, blessings everybody. I'm happy to be here, happy to take part in this and kind of give my perspective. I feel like I should give some disclosure about how I came to my conclusions or my philosophies or my theologies or my ideologies, because it's interesting that I'm sitting here with George and Bryan, and I come from an LDS background, so I was LDS till I was 37, left the church because God told me to leave the church. And so during that time, you know, it takes a lot of examination of who God is and what our responsibility is to God, and who do we need to get to God and through who and whatever. That being said, my presentation or the things that I say, I will represent the best that I can the understandings that I have of particularly the Hopi way of life. So as he said, my father is Hopi. Hopi's let me kind of tell you the Hopi creation story, because I think that that'll give some value to this. So the Hopi people believe that they came from a different world, where this world was evil and wicked, and people weren't being nice to each other, weren't being loving to each other, weren't taking care of each other, weren't living a good way of life, and so they're looking for another place to live. They found a place to live, and it happened to be here in what Pan Indians would call Turtle Island. They came up through the Grand Canyon, and they came to this place, and there was a person here, and they called him Masao. He was the god of this world. He's the god of this earth. And the Hopi people that came up, they said appropriately, hey, you know, we're fleeing from this place. We're trying to get from somewhere because they're evil people down there, and we would like to live here. And Masao said, okay, you can live here, but if you're going to live here, you're going to have to take care of this place. And that's kind of the key point that I want to get into people's minds is stewardship of place, stewardship of location. So Hopi people have been given stewardship of location by the Creator. So this is a divine connection that is kind of an inseparable thing, right? I think we could all admit in however you interpret the divine or whatever. If the divine tells you something, that's a divine mandate. And it doesn't matter who comes along and what government comes along, but that's between you and God. So when it comes to here, you know, we're in Utah Valley, and I want to acknowledge that Utah Valley, you know, this is Ute land, this is Shoshone land, this is Goshute land. And we are occupiers of this land. And by being occupiers of this land, we have a responsibility to understand what those people's stewardship are and fight for their rights or fight for what they were given stewardship over. And that would be environment. And I think that's why we're here, and that's why you all are here, is to figure out what is our responsibility, what can I do to make the world a better place, what can I do to make Utah County world a better place, and so this is good. So the Masao, he says, yes, you can live here, take care of this place, but also take care of each other. I want to also relay or think so both of my organizations, we focus on environmental stewardship, environmental activism, environmental responsibility, also human rights, because they're all intertwined, right? So as indigenous people, and if we all think about it, really, we're all connected. I mean, we understand the ecosystem. We understand that things, there's a purpose for everything, even the mosquitoes. And I always hear this thing, oh, well, God, why did he save the mosquitoes? There's a purpose for the mosquitoes, right? So there is purpose for everything. There's a connection that we all have to the creation. And as George has said, like, we shouldn't be atom-centric, right?
Well, I was using the word atomistic, which is
That's a different. Okay. I'll just say anthropocentric. We shouldn't be anthropocentric in our worldview. And that's kind of what I think institutionalized religion, Western religions have done, is kind of made us be dominion holders over things, dominion holders over women, dominion over lesser cultures or races or whatever. I think that's a damage that has been done by a lot of religions. But so I'm happy to be here. I acknowledge the land, and I myself also acknowledge that I am a foreigner on this land, like in every aspect. You heard my heritage. My mother, German, Irish, English, Mexican, Chemehuevi. Chemehuevis are from Arizona. My father is Hopi. Hopis are from Arizona. So that being said, I am a foreigner, and I have to respect the values of the people that were here first, that have this divine mandate. I guess we'll have questions, so I'll leave it at that. But I just think that everybody being here is good, and this is where you should be, and you should just continue on in a good way, and take care of the environment, because it's about our future, right? It's for our 7 generations, and really think about that. Kukwai.
Thank you, Carl. Our final speaker today is Bryan, and I didn't ask you how to pronounce your last name. Debbink? Debbink, I'm sorry. Bryan is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist who currently attends South Valley Unitarian Universalist Society. He is a retired, in quotes, not sure what that means, but is a retired engineer turned at-home dad of 2. He dedicates his free time to exploring Utah's wilderness and lobbying for nonpartisan policies, something we could all use, at the state and federal level to ensure its enjoyment for future generations. Let's welcome Bryan.
Thanks, Michael. I guess I'm really honored to be here. I think that Thomas wanted to get actual Unitarian Universalist ministers, but I am representing Unitarian Universalism today. First of all, how many people know, let me start over. On a scale of 1 to 5, hold up your hand. 5 being, I know what Unitarian Universalism is, and I think that I am a Unitarian Universalist, and I attend a Unitarian Universalist church. 1 being, I have no idea what you're talking about. What is a Unitarian Universalist? Okay, that seems about right. I got a lot of 1s, a few higher numbers, but so I'll give like the 40,000 foot view. Unitarian Universalists. That's a big word. There's actually 2 different denominations: Unitarians and Universalists. They joined at some point. We're a smaller denomination still at this point. The first thing to know is that Unitarian Universalism is non-creedal. And what that means is that there's no specific set of beliefs that we have that like imbue you as a Unitarian Universalist. The biggest one is a belief in God, right? Most Western religions, most religions in general, kind of require some sort of belief in a divine, whether it's multiple gods, one God. That takes a lot of different forms. Instead of having a creed of rules, as I would look at it, we have a base set of values that we call the 7 principles, which are essentially what most religions have as a set of principles. You can think about it as the Ten Commandments, right? These are like the really important things that hold us together. And so Unitarian Universalists come from a lot of different backgrounds. The congregation that I attend in Cottonwood Heights, and I think it's probably true in most places in Utah, there's a lot of ex-LDS folks that end up at our church. In fact, some still practice LDS. People do both, and I don't really know how they do that, but I've been a Unitarian Universalist my whole life, so that's something that I like to discuss with people. Because that is really what our community supports, which is people being on a spiritual path and supporting everybody on it. Like I said, there are 7 principles, but for time, I think the 6th principle is probably the one that's most important right here, right now, is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And a lot of times this just gets, we like to call this the social justice principle. The 7th principle talks about the interconnected web of all existence, which is related to the environment, but I really like to focus on the 6th one because it's about the justice of the policies we put in place, the things that we do in the world. And I could talk a lot about the history of both Unitarian Universalists and all that sort of thing, but we'll stick to that. Social justice and Unitarian Universalism, we have a long history of activism for gender, racial, LGBTQ rights. For air pollution and climate change, it's a little less obvious. Those things are not necessarily, there's like a second veil there, right? I mean, so you can say we're polluting a lot, it's hurting the land, it's hurting the people that are there. So there's like a second step versus, hey, there's a person here that I need to deal with. I think that environmental justice and climate justice, the word climate justice may be new. I think that these are 2 different things. They're related but different, and they can be tricky to navigate because they do have some opposing prescriptions of what you would do to have justice in either one of those 2 things. But Unitarian Universalists in general, with the approach that we take to helping everybody on their spiritual path, I know that I personally take that into a greater sense of when I'm working on social justice issues and specifically climate justice, which I'm mostly involved with. I take that like sort of listening and wanting to bring people along sort of attitude, and I think that's something that Unitarian Universalists would have in common. So I'll start with a story. Well, I'll go to a story, I should say, since I started, about environmental justice. Back in the mid-aughts, a congregation in Bellingham, Washington, there was a congregant with experience in indigenous rights activism. And she noticed that all around her were native people's lands, right? And they had this congregation of 250 people. It's not huge, not tiny. They had no connection. And I mean, I feel very similarly here in Utah, where we're in this place where we have all of native peoples around us, and in fact, we're on native people's lands. So she took it upon herself to make some connections with those tribes, and it takes a long time to build those relationships, and not with any specific goal in mind, but just knowing that these are people who they share borders with, and we need to interact with them. And it wasn't too long later, about a year and a half later, after she had built up these relationships, that there was a plan for a coal exporting facility that essentially was on the Lumi tribe's burial grounds and would disrupt their fishing, their fisheries, which were protected by treaty. And so this was something that congregation ended up rallying around because they had made those trusting relationships with those people that they didn't have a whole lot in common with, other than this idea that this is not right? This is an injustice, and it is environmental, right? I mean, it's not just a border issue or anything like that. They were going to be disrupting the environment, and amazingly enough, big, huge huge corporation. Over the next 6 years after that, they battled, and eventually they got legally in, I don't know, some court said that they couldn't build the coal facility there, and it may have happened if they hadn't made those connections, right? So that's one person, a small congregation, teaming up with people who are the affected peoples, right? And saying, we can bring our resources, but what's your solution, right? What do you guys want to see done? And I know I'm kind of going on a little long at this point. On climate change, on climate justice, I don't know what everybody's understanding would be, but the idea, I'll just say real quick, for me, it is when we are filling the air with CO2 and affecting other people less than the people in Bangladesh or other people, the tens of millions of people who live on coastlines. There's many different examples of where we have injustice when we ourselves are polluting the air with carbon dioxide like crazy. And that is something that, for me, I find it to be a spiritual path, lobbying for real policies that could affect climate change. I would say Unitarian Universalist, because it does tend to be pretty individual. They tend to do things like, because we're white and affluent, we buy hybrids and put solar panels up and do windmills, which is great, but it's not going to make a difference for global climate change. You individually, I know that it's really hard to hear sometimes, but like when you think that you're doing such a great job doing something, it's it's not going to help at this point, unless everybody is doing it. And the only way to get everybody to do it is have big national, becoming international policies. And that's the work that I do with Citizens Climate Lobby, and I do similar things to achieve those ends at the state level. And I'll leave it at that.
Lots of great ideas from a cultural, spiritual perspective, and we have plenty of time for some questions. So we'll open up to the floor. Now, there's been a request to have, if you have a question, I hope that you're all comfortable doing this, but we are recording this, and we're trying to put today's symposium out to a broader audience. And we have a microphone over there that will enable people to hear the questions that are asked. So if you wish to ask a question, if you would kindly go over to the microphone over there, you can just create a line, make casual, but ask your question over there. That would be very much appreciated. If you have one and you're not comfortable doing that, we're very happy to take your question. It just won't be recorded. Okay? All right. So we're open for questions now.
Hey, Carl, I just wanted to follow up on something you alluded to, and that is the fact that Utah Valley includes Goshute land, Shoshone land, and Ute land, and that there are issues with stewardship from their traditions. And could you just expand on that a little bit, what you understand about their ideas towards stewardship?
Okay, good. Thank you. So their ideas towards stewardship would be, one is that the value of a fish is the same as the value of a human, right? The value of the air is the same as the value of a human. The value of the mountains is the same as a human. So it's one of equality and responsibility. So I like to look at it in the sense of a familial relationship. Like we understand, or we have an understanding of what a family is, and I know that can be defined in different ways, which is the point. Is that here in a Western society we say, well, a family is a mother and a father and kids, and then you have cousins and you have grandparents, and it goes like that, right? But for indigenous people, even in the human way, a family is not just that. A family is like all of your mom's sisters are your moms, all of your dad's dads are your dads, you know, and there's a relationship right there, but it extends past that. Is that the relationship? That's why, I mean, we have these movies and it's a cliche or whatever, you know, brother bear, you know, whatever. But that's true, right? Like for the indigenous people, the culture says that bear is our relative. And in the same way that you would fight for your relative, you would fight for that bear. So right now at this point, like I was, the Gwich'in people are fighting for the Arctic refuge up in Alaska, right? And And it's their responsibility to that caribou herd, because those are their brothers. They made a pact. See, that's the thing is that these are pacts, not just with the Creator, but those are pacts with their relationships. And they promised the caribou, they said, we're going to fight for you. We're going to take care of you. And the caribou said, we're going to feed you. This is the same as the buffalo, right? That's the same thing that the buffalo did. They say, we're going to take care of you. We're going to feed you. We're going to clothe you. We're going to do those things for you. You respect us, only take what you need, whatever. But we're going to lay down our lives for you. And that's one aspect I want to bring up also, is that our humility as human beings, as people, we need to be humble and knowing that life dies for us. All of these animals are dying for us so we can live. All of these plants are dying for us so that we can live. That's just another point in the indigenous value system. But like basically that would be it. It's just fighting. It's protecting Utah Lake. Not polluting Utah Lake. It's protecting each other also. I forgot, but Bryan, he talks about, what is it? Universalist. What's your church?
Unitarian Universalist.
Unitarian Universalist. Yeah. So he brings up some points I just want to kind of expand on. Is that when I first started my organization, Pandos, we were fighting for Standing Rock, which is the same situation. It's fracking, it's oil, it's whatever. It's exploitation of indigenous land, which is all of this. It's exploitation of indigenous land. It's exploitation of indigenous people. It's exploitation of us as well. But that group has put their has walked the walk. They just don't talk the talk. They walk the walk, and that's what people need to be like. We can say all of these things. Well, my culture believes this. My religion says this. Well, do it. Just do it. And I see that people are doing it. So I would also, because they're a Universalist church, First Unitarian in Salt Lake, helped us out a lot. I also want to just, because I have the time, is if you want to be involved in something, there's so many places to be involved in. I just want to name SLCR Protectors. That's who I'm a chairperson of. Pandos. That's who I'm a chairperson of. Utah Denabekeya, Uplift, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, the Citizens Climate Lobby, which I see a lot of the places that I go to. Utah Physicians for Clean Air, all of those. I do want to say that we have fights right now, because you're probably wondering, well, what do I do right now? I want to say that we need to fight for the Bears Ears. And it's interesting because John Curtis actually was the one that solidified the Bears Ears, and which I think is a disaster. He doesn't care what I say, but I talked to him a couple times. But Bears Ears is important, because Bears Ears, if you care about the environment, you care about Bears Ears. We should care about the inland port that's happening right now. I hope that you all know what's going on with there. The Salt Lake City, the inland port, that is a disaster waiting to happen. That is getting pushed through. And then the White Mesa uranium mill down in southern Utah. But I'll stop. Thanks.
Am I this tall? Hi. Actually, my question is for George Handley. I just wasn't sure if you were aware at BYU, because you're still a professor there as well. Some students reached out, and I'm quoting them. That's why I brought my computer. Is that they're pushing the administration at BYU to start a sustainability office. I didn't know if you were aware of that. And then I thought maybe you would give a plug for your book, Climate Skepticism. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yes, I was aware of that group. In fact, I've been in conversation with them, the students that you're referring to, and I think it's a great development. That's something we've been working for a long time at BYU. I find that students at BYU are very, very persuasive and very effective when they advocate for things. So I love to see their enthusiasm. I have another group of students right now who are pushing for banning of plastic bags in Provo, we're working on that. So I over the years, I've just had waves and waves of very extraordinary students who are caring about environmental issues, not despite the fact that they're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but because of it. And that to me is inspiring. And thank you for plugging my book. I didn't know that anyone would know about it, but it's I co-authored a book that just came out called Climate Skepticism, a Transnational Eco-Critical Analysis, and we looked at, three other co-authors looked at climate skepticism in the United States, the UK, Germany, and France. And I wrote the chapter about the United States. There's a lot more to say about it, but it's sort of a look at how theology is a fishy, squishy thing. You know, it kind of can, you know, the Bible was used to justify slavery. The Bible inspired abolition, right? So there's a way in which theology can turn on a number of concepts depending on how people want it to turn. And I'm convinced, after looking carefully at theology, both in my own tradition and other Christian traditions, Native American traditions, that all kinds of theology can be used and abused to do all kinds of damage. So I don't think there's a correct theology. I don't think there's a right way, a right cosmology. And I actually think we waste a lot of energy fighting over worldviews that we think are correct, when in fact what we ought to be doing is finding common ground to figure out what the practical solutions are to the problems that we face. Because it gets too, when people feel threatened by a discourse that says your worldview is wrong, then they pull out. They say, well, screw that. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But if you are invited in to say, what do you bring to the table? What do you think you can contribute to this problem? Then there's a greater, and what that often does is it causes a rereading. I mean, religious traditions are extraordinarily flexible. They can be reread in very radical ways. They don't have to throw out every single doctrinal principle, but they can discover that certain doctrinal principles that were once used to justify an attitude that we no longer find acceptable can now become tools for doing some good in a very different direction. So that's actually, and the root meaning of the word religion, it has a number of root meanings, or at least they're debated, but one of them is to reread, which I think is a quite radical concept, that religion, if it's rethought, reread in a new way, because we're posing new questions to it, can rise to a challenge that previously that religious tradition may have thought was too threatening to even deal with, right? And I'd rather just deny that the problem is there. So we all deal with denial. I mean, this is a massive problem that we have to work through because there's all kinds of ways in which we're individually contributing to the problems that we're trying to solve. And but I do agree that large-scale solutions are necessary. I think the small-scale steps, however, can be very motivating to people to eventually get to that point where they say, well, I've done the energy audit on my home, I now use public transportation, now what? I want something else.
Okay, my name's Elizabeth Luntz, and I'm on Utah Moms for Clean Air, which is another advocacy group.
Sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah. And this is for George Handley. They mentioned you're on the Provo City Council now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's very inspiring, because I feel like that's really the next level we need to get to, is getting people that understand science and have environmental ethics in those positions of power, and we need to get the people who don't out of power. So I was just wondering, at the municipal level, what kind of changes are you seeing or would like to see regarding energy production and transportation that's at the municipal level that could be multiplied across, and copied at multiple cities?
Yeah, boy, I've been on the city council for just over a year, and I'm more persuaded than ever. I was persuaded of this before I ran, but that you really almost have to have some environmental understanding to be on the city council, because the vast number of decisions you're making impact air, land, and water. And if you don't have a sense of stewardship, or you don't even have a sense of how it all connects, then it can be quite dangerous. On the other hand, I have been very humbled by the transition from the realm of theory to the realm of practice. It's really, really hard to craft good policy. It's really hard. And it's very important to listen to and have information from a wide variety of voices. So I have a little more compassion for the ineffectiveness of government sometimes. and a little more patience. But at the same time, I did run precisely for the reasons that you identified. I felt like, you know, I had very little effect on what was happening in Washington, D.C., even though I've lobbied there many times on wilderness issues and other issues that have been mentioned. And I've lobbied in Salt Lake, and I just thought, well, you know, let's try local. And a city can do an enormous amount, and there's more to say about this than I'll have time to, but I'll just briefly say, and I agree, I think John Curtis has a mixed record environmentally at best, but I think as a mayor of Provo, he was extraordinarily effective in pushing through the UVX system that is now in place. I took it to get here today. I'm really grateful for it. I use it all the time. And I think that public transportation and biking and active transportation are vital for city design. And we have a bike committee in Provo who are actively trying to convince the city of the things that they need to do to redesign streets. I mean, a lot of our streets are ridiculously wide, and that's extraordinarily wasteful. Most cities are designed for the automobile, and that's it. And I think it's been a bit of a mind bend for the city of Provo to start thinking in a different way about designing the city for pedestrians and bikers as well as for cars. I mean, obviously we have to do the work for cars, but we are installing 33 new electric charging stations in Provo for electric vehicles in this next year. And I am in the process of trying to convince my fellow city council members that we need to have energy goals for the city of Provo that will help us reduce our, we are a public energy agency shared with 5 other cities. So we actually have our own autonomy to say we want more solar farms. And actually Provo just bought a major farm, and we're looking at hopefully having 50% of our energy coming from low carbon sources by 2030, which is a modest goal, but I think it's at least a goal that we've never even had. So we're moving in the right direction.
I'm Lynn England.
Hi,
good
Lynn.
to see a couple of you again. But I'm curious. I've long heard both Carl and Mormons talk about, and I see it in the Universalists, to question of spirituality and presence of the spiritual. Why do we bother to talk about that stuff when no one really cares? We are in a world where we can go ahead and tear up rows and rows of pine trees so that we can build student housing. We don't seem to ever care that maybe there is spirit present in those things. It seems to be that we give lip service to that, but that it's really irrelevant. Is there any sense in continuing to talk about that dimension?
Good job. I love you.
I do you too, Carl.
That's such a good point, because that I think that's kind of been a problem of environmentalism and a lot of different things. Is like we keep doing and talking and rallying, right? But what comes of it, and what do we do out of it? So here's my position. My position is in original stewardship and in privilege, and in people being educated enough to understand their privilege, understand where they are, understand that their ideology or their theologies are actually foreign to this place, and to kind of get back to the roots of where is our responsibility, where's our moral responsibility. And I would just say that the moral responsibility is to the indigenous people, the first people whose land you're on. If I was to go to England, it would be my moral responsibility to understand their values, what they want, and fight for them. This is privilege. Like, people are privileged to not care. People are just privileged to say, well, my religion says this. Well, frankly, it doesn't matter what your religion says when you're on indigenous land. It matters when you are in line with the indigenous people's voice. But if people would understand the connection, that spiritual connection and that familiar relationship, I think that can make a change. But it is daunting and it is discouraging because you don't see it happening. and people overlook that. But so that's just kind of my responses. I do feel like we do need to keep continuing on in understanding the premise of why we fight for what we fight for.
Yeah, I'll just add. I think that spirituality is critical, right? There is a large moral argument in almost every single religion that I'm aware of for preserving our land and taking good care of it. And I think that, it, as much as like I'm working on things at the federal and state level that George apparently got a little bit sick of, demonstrating at a smaller level the support for taking action is so critical. So having now, I don't know, 6 cities in Utah with resolutions about clean energy, with targets and that sort of thing. I don't know where Provo stands exactly on that at this particular moment, is really important to getting larger action. Getting your spiritual home, like everybody in that congregation, church, synagogue, wherever, understanding the importance of stewardship to that religion and their moral compass is so important. So, I mean, it starts at the individual level, just understanding that this is something we need to do, and then growing up from there, I think is super important. So, yeah, talking about it in a spiritual sense we've talked about it in our heads, right, since the 80s, maybe even before that, right, that, oh, yeah, climate change is happening, right? Well, then people start to discuss, I mean, George wrote a book on it, or helped write a book on it, about the skepticism that comes up, because now you're debating facts or whatever. But you need to be able to connect the heart with the mind, and that's where spirituality comes in.
I just wanted to further on that, because I had a question for you too, Bryan, because you talked about individual actions, and I believe in individual actions as a way of being prisoners of hope, right? That was Ambassador Tutu's discussion, because it is, sometimes you feel like you're batting your head against a wall, but it is collectively, I mean, it starts, and what George is doing in the community is having an effect, and then it's cities, but it has to start individually, and then the growth to the community, and then hopefully someday legislation, right? So I still feel that it's important to do individual action, and I just wanted to get your comment on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I completely... Sure. Yeah, just to be clear, doing individual action is not... I think I said it doesn't matter, but to people individually, yes, absolutely it matters, and it matters that people are seeing that other people are doing it. I just find in Unitarian Universalism, people then say, oh, I'm doing my part, right? I drive a Prius. I'm the best, right? Right? I mean, it ends up being that attitude of okay, I'm doing what I can, right? And yeah, exactly, checking a box, right?
All right, so Michael had to run, so yeah, let's thank our speakers again. Thank you very much.
Let me put a plug in for Mormons Environmental Stewardship Alliance also. Ty Markham, they're awesome.